Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Lauren Swartz, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. For over 70 years, this council has brought our community fresh, nonpartisan, civil discourse on the critical issues affecting the world. And of course, today's program is no different. Just over 10 years ago, in December of 2010, a Tunisian street vendor set himself on fire in protest of the autocratic government, and his actions inspired a revolutionary movement across the Middle East and North Africa, commonly referred to as the Arab Spring. We'll have the opportunity to speak with two expert panelists today about the change and the impact that the so-called Arab Spring has had over the last 10 years. We'll discover what might come next for this complex and diverse part of the world and the drivers that are at play. Of course, we'll have an opportunity for audience Q&A, so please send your questions in anytime using the Q&A feature on your Zoom platform. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests. First, we are honored to have Dr. James Zogby, who is co-founder and president of the Arab American Institute with us today. He is director of Zogby Research Services, a firm that has conducted groundbreaking surveys across the Middle East. Dr. Zogby also writes a weekly column published in 12 countries, and he is featured frequently on national and international media as an expert on Middle East affairs. He has also published the highly acclaimed book, Arab Voices. And next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lina Khatib, who is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. She was formerly director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut and co-founding head of the program on Arab Reform and Democracy at Stanford University Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Lina's research focuses on the international relations of the Middle East, Islamist groups and security, political transitions, and foreign policy, with a special attention to the Syrian conflict. Welcome to you both, and thank you for being with us today. I'll pass the virtual microphone to each of you for brief opening remarks, and then we'll turn to our moderated discussion, followed by questions from the audience. James, let's start with you for opening remarks, and then we'll turn to Lina. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm pleased to do this. I know it's the 10th anniversary. It's also the 10th anniversary of Arab Voices when I was in Chatham House, actually, with my book, and we had a wonderful discussion there with the folks, and also with the Philadelphia World Affairs Council. And I think I sold many books at both events. So thank you very much for convening this. There were two events actually in this decade that I think have been transformative for the Middle East. One certainly were the mass uprisings that occurred in several Arab countries, as you note. The other, and I'll get to that toward the end of my remarks, was the US withdrawal from Iraq that I believe was done somewhat precipitously and not well planned. And it brought on consequences that I'll get into in a moment. First of all, the mass uprisings, I've noted that sometimes analysts will take an event that is occurring that they don't understand and try to see it through the prism of what they do understand. And I think this was one of them. They called it Arab Spring because it reminded them of both the Prague Spring and then the other springs that followed the springs in the Soviet bloc countries. This was not the same. These were separate events. Certainly they inspired one another, but they were brought about by different circumstances in each of the countries, unique to each of the countries, although some of the issues were the same. They occurred mostly in the Arab republics, the one exception being Bahrain. These were the long-standing military regimes that shared a number of factors. One was that they had appealed to a kind of an Arab nationalism. They lacked, however, broad legitimacy and had become increasingly ossified and corrupt, with small privileged elites who were draining wealth for themselves, their families, and cronies. They were mostly youth-led. and they were focused in their demands on jobs and on freedom. The collapse of services. This was a desperate Arab public, and also they raised the issues of corruption because the elites had gone one step too far on a number of instances. Of all of them, the one that we could call, I remember there was an article in New York Review of Books suggesting that Egypt was a revolution that had turned Lenin upside down. Lenin had argued that revolutions needed to be violent, and they said this was a revolution that was nonviolent. It was written by two people who I have great respect for, but it wasn't a revolution. What happened was the military said, oh, okay, Mubarak, you're out. They had an election, the Muslim Brotherhood won, and then the military said, okay, you're out. And the first was a bit nonviolent. The second was very violent. The only true revolution of the events that occurred in this period was the Tunisian one, because it resulted actually in a change in governance. It remains quite fragile, but in the polling that we've done in Tunisia, it's the one country where most Arabs see it as having been successful. And also Tunisians themselves see it as having been successful. They have lots of grievances. They have lots of problems. But when we ask what we call the Reagan questions, are you better off than you were 5 years ago? Although Reagan said 4 years ago. And do you think you'll be better off in the next 5? Tunisians are the one country where pluralities, fairly substantial pluralities, say we're better off today, and we think we're going to still be better off in the future. Egypt, on the other hand, by 3-1, Egyptians say they're worse off today than they were 5 years ago. And Egyptians by 2-1 say they don't think they're going to be better off in the next 5. I mean, there's a sense of, despite the boastings of the military and the elites around them who have ended up falling in line saying, oh, everything is great and grand. The people in Egypt do not feel that they've actually been better off. Repression has increased. It's not only the Muslim Brotherhood, but tens of thousands are in jail, maybe 60,000. We don't even know the exact numbers. It includes progressive secular elites and people in media and folks who've been critical of the regime. Thought leaders have been cowered into silence. And as I said, Egyptians have lost confidence overall, despite the fact that there's the government's in denial. When we polled about the confidence in institutions in Egypt, going back to 11, 12, 13, what we got were almost 90%, 91, 2, 3% saying that they were very confident in the military. The military did have prestige, and today the numbers for the military are down in the 50s. It's a drop of almost 40 points. And when we ask about the discredited Morsi government, that actually most Egyptians, even at the time of the overthrow of that government, said they had no confidence in it. Today, Egyptians give Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood government about the same score. Egyptians aren't happy, despite, as I said, the fact that government will say that they are. Now, what has occurred is that those two were I think the poster children for Arab Spring, but there were others. There was Libya, there was Yemen, there was Syria. And I'll get into them in a minute, but there have been even since then uprisings more recently in Lebanon, in Iraq, Algeria, Sudan. Of these, I think the what is looking like a success story is Sudan, where there is the dictator's gone. There's a government created that has equal civilian, some of the leaders of the revolt and the military. And there's a 3-year transition period. We'll see at the end of the 3-year transition period whether the military decides to cede control to permanent civilian control. The situations in Syria, Libya, and Yemen have been very different. And this Syria was, they're all fragmented societies. They were fragmented societies. Syria by sect and by tribe, Libya by tribe and by region, and Yemen by sect, tribe, and region. The old regimes were deposed, but with that, groups either sought or were sought out by external powers that resulted in prolonging civil conflict. And today they all remain uncertain as to what their future will be. And this brings me, I think, to the Iraq War, because prior to the Iraq War, the Middle East was stable but fragile. There was an order that existed with the republics, the monarchies, and some sort of fledgling experience or experiments in democracy in some of the countries. But it was largely a stable order. In the neoconservatives who led George Bush into this conflict had the opinion that we needed a big war and a decisive show of American force to assert American hegemony for the next century, to avert the possibility of a multipolar world emerging. The problem is that the Iraq War did exactly the opposite of what they wanted it to do. The result at the end of the Iraq War was that, or in the middle of the Iraq War, was that the US military was depleted, exhausted, humiliated by the fact that it could not control the insurgency on the ground. Bigger and more serious, I think, for the US was its depletion of its prestige around the world and respect for the United States as a leader. More serious for the region was that Iran had become unleashed and emboldened. It found a foothold in Iraq and also expanded itself without great resistance in the rest of the region. And that accounts for what we see playing out to some extent in Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. To be sure, these fragmented countries have other countries that have come into play. Saudi Arabia is in play in every one of them. Turkey is in play in Syria and also to some extent in Lebanon. In Libya, Turkey, Russia, UAE, Qatar, and others are in play there. But the notion that the multipolarity of the region makes the solution of these problems more complicated is what I think is important right now. Thankfully, didn't occur in Sudan. Hasn't, although there are players at the table and intervening or trying to intervene in Tunisia. To date, it has not been as unsettling as it has been in other countries. And there we are. Look, there are some lessons. I'll cut short because I think I'm getting close to the end. There are some lessons I think that need to be understood. The first is for the youth rebellion itself. I remember Ann Patterson spoke to them right before Tamarrud, which was the uprising that the revolt that led to the military creating what in effect was a coup d'etat, even though the Egyptians sort of get hysterical if you use the word coup d'etat. She said to them, form a political party, organize, win the next election. She was dismissed for saying that. They said that was ridiculous. But there's a problem. And the problem is that in the countries, even where there is a democratic process of sorts, not by any means perfect, but the absence of alternative political parties leading the change has been a real problem. Only in Tunisia was there a civil society sufficient enough that a group could form to compete with the Muslim Brotherhood. When the regimes left, the only organized force in many of those countries was the Muslim Brotherhood. And most people in our polling have no confidence in politicized or weaponized religion as a source of governance. And where the Muslim Brotherhood has governed, they have failed. Palestine being one, Egypt being another, even though they were overthrown there was no confidence in them while they were governing. And certainly in Tunisia, the experience has been the same. And so the need to organize in Lebanon and in Iraq in particular right now, as there was the case in Sudan, where a political alternative is organized by the resistance, by the uprising leadership, is critical. For the rest of us, I think, I always used to argue that the US would offer the region what it didn't want, what it didn't see as a priority from us, and we wouldn't respond with what the region saw was a priority. The only one who got it right, and nothing happened with it, was President Obama in his second anniversary speech on Cairo, where he spoke about Tunisia starting and how it unfolded in the region. And he said, we didn't start it, we can't direct it, we can't determine its outcome. What we can do is provide support for the building blocks of the democracy that people seek. And that is to invest in job creation, to invest in improving healthcare, to invest in education. Because when we poll across the Arab world and you ask people what their top 3 priorities are, it's jobs, healthcare, and education. That's what they want. And when you say, what do you want the US to help you with? That's what they want. They don't want us meddling in their internal affairs, which is what we try to do, to teach democracy, whatever. That's not what they want from us. What they want is what we can offer best, which is improving their daily lives. I'll stop there and hear from Dr. Khatib.
Thank you, Dr. Zogby. Lina, opening remarks.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And it's great to see Dr. Zogby even virtually. Well, I will pick up from where he left off, which is talk about the US role and all that. First of all, I am not saying by any means that the way the region, the Middle East or the Arab world in particular is today is only the responsibility of US foreign policy. But I want to also talk about the role of external actors and taking the region to where it is today, and about engagement between the internal and external dynamics. So when we think about all the uprisings that happened in the Arab world, with all the hope that people had 10 years ago, and how, as Dr. Zogby pointed out, most of these countries did not result in democratization. Actually, most of these uprisings ended up being conflicts or reinforced autocratic structures. So in Egypt right now, we have an autocracy, and I will say the same about many countries in the region, across the Middle East. It's not just that there are internal dynamics at play here. It's also the case that under the Obama administration in particular, the United States said a lot of the right things about, for example, supporting people's rights to freedom, justice, and bread, which were some of the key demands by people on the street. However, this good rhetoric was not coupled with enough action. So even when we think about a country like Tunisia and what has just been alluded to in terms of what it needs for its democracy to be consolidated, we look at US foreign policy and US assistance and Western assistance, not just the US in general, and say to ourselves, is this actually at an adequate level to make a difference, a positive difference on the ground? And sadly, the reality, it is not. And so in many ways, the people in the region who sometimes, unlike the case of the US invasion of Iraq, which was an illegal invasion, which the people did not want, but on the ground, quite often people did want the US to help, and US actions did not, whether on the development side or the political side. On the political side, particularly in the case of Syria, there was wide support for the US to engage diplomatically once the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who is the president of Syria, started cracking down with violence on the people protesting against him. There was hope amongst the people on the ground because of Obama's rhetoric at the time saying Bashar al-Assad must go, that the US would do something about it. And here, I am not talking about military intervention. I am talking about diplomatic engagement. What we saw instead is US disengagement from the region politically. And I think here a lot of people might say, well, this engagement is about being neutral. If, we kind of remove ourselves from the picture, then we have no consequence on the ground for this decision. And actually, the reality is, whether it's action or inaction, there are always implications on the ground. Disengagement is not neutrality. Disengagement has implications. When the US removes itself from the Middle East in this way, meaning politically, diplomatically, other actors will find space to increase their own influence and engagement in the region. And here we saw a rise for Russia as an external actor who intervened in the Syrian conflict, mainly to present itself as a superpower to the international community once more, especially vis-a-vis the West and particularly the US. You had a growing role for Iran. You had a growing role for Turkey. These are regional actors that saw an opportunity for themselves to increase their own influence and activities in countries outside of their borders in the Middle East. So here we see that the international community does play a role. And this role may not be an active one, it may be a passive one, but it does have serious implications on the ground. So when we talk about where the region is 10 years after the Arab uprisings, we have to remember that this region does not exist in a vacuum. It's a region that is very much affected by geopolitics, by things that happen outside of this region's borders as well. On a note of hope, I also want to say that the people on the ground in a lot of countries in this region, despite the failure of the uprisings of 10 years ago to bring about democracy, have not just stopped trying. And yes, trying is not necessarily taking the form of popular protests, but it is happening. And sometimes in very small micro ways at the community level, or like in Lebanon, people are finally trying to form new independent political parties outside of the ruling parties of the political elites who have ruled the country for decades. These attempts are still in their early days, and perhaps right now they may not result in a change in the system, but we need to start sometime. And one of the dangers of saying, oh, the Arab uprisings failed, is that outside observers may miss these small dynamics that are actually quite meaningful and that are happening on the ground. And as Dr. Zogby said, it's not like the grievances have gone away either. People are still angry. They are still hungry. They are still concerned about access to basic services. And eventually, grievances lead people to want change. Now, if they don't have the tools to basically make the change happen now, it doesn't mean that they're going to give up. They're going to continue for as long as the grievances continue. And while the autocrats are in power, sadly, the grievances are likely to continue. So let's not find ourselves 10 years down the line surprised again by uprisings happening in the region, or by political systems finding new voices emerge that people had missed or dismissed because they weren't paying attention to the small changes happening on the ground. Because ultimately, a lot of change is not necessarily through revolution, but it's through incremental processes that grow over time. So let's pay attention to what's happening on the ground, and let's not dismiss these small attempts at change, because as I said, they could be the start of a snowball later on. And this is where I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khatib. A lot to unpack here. I've got 4 or 5 new questions I've written down since we started. I want to build upon the topic that you focused on of other nations getting involved and how they can be helpful and harmful. As we know, there's a certain amount of skepticism regarding foreign and international aid for the Middle East and North Africa. You talked about diplomatic engagement or lack of engagement being all of it matters. So when we think about aid, humanitarian and financial aid, there's a lot of questions around this region. Where does the money go? How is it used? Is it really making its way into the hands of citizens who need it most, and whether it functions as a catalyst for change or rather just a Band-Aid that sounds good at home to constituents that are worried and say, do something. So Dr. Khatib, what is your perspective on aid to the region? And are there other methods, in addition to the diplomatic channels you just spoke about, that countries like the US and others could use to help foster peace in this region?
Okay, sorry. I think the US has a crucial role to play when it comes to trying to foster peace, because you need stabilization. And stabilization is often seen as something to do with security. So we see US investment sometimes in training armies or surveillance or giving security assistance basically to countries. But I think stabilization really happens through good governance, first and foremost. And one of the biggest lessons from the invasion of Iraq of 2003, which the US and my own country, the UK, led, is that, yes, that invasion, as we know, was not legal. However, it went ahead. There was a change of regime, but the new regime that was effectively installed by the UK and the US was a regime in which there was no attention by the UK or the US to good governance within that regime. And this allowed political actors in Iraq to take advantage and use the state as a cash cow to enrich themselves and form, in certain cases, private armies that would serve their own personal interests as opposed to the national interest. And this caused wide resentment in Iraq, caused a lot of tension, and eventually with time, this lack of good governance is what led to the emergence of ISIS, the Islamic State terrorist organization, that not just took advantage of people's grievances to say, look, this government has ignored you, we can present an alternative, but also when this organization was attacking the second biggest city in Iraq, Mosul, the Iraqi army did not put up a fight against it because the Iraq army did not feel that it was a national army. So this is what you get when you do not pay attention to good governance. And I think when it comes to aid money, sometimes a lot of attention is focused on humanitarian aid and not enough attention is focused on governance support and development. And I think these two things are very crucial. So this is how I think the US can play an active role in stabilization.
Thank you. And let's build a bit more in that, shifting over to you, Dr. Zogby. I think there's an assumption, particularly in the West, that democracy is the right way. And that if we just try hard enough, that nations will find democracy and prosper, and we can send some aid over and everything will just move in that direction. But there is an often repeated question that we'd like to talk about today. Are Arabs ready for democracy? It's remained elusive for so long. And even since this last decade, with so many calls and protests across the region for change, many nations, as you've discussed, have collapsed into ongoing civil wars and relapsed into new dictatorships. And even Tunisia, the success story, has a lot of challenges right now. Dr. Zogby, the question we'd like to take a step back. Why is democracy so elusive in this region?
Oh, I thought you were going to say, why is it so elusive in this country?
That's the next webinar.
Okay. Look, it's, and I think that's a serious issue, right? Is that we have assumptions about democracy, what it is, how it works, which are being proven to be false, even as we operate here. I think that I'm going to call you Lina. I think Lina is right. The issues are good governance. The issues are responsiveness to people's needs. The issues are protecting of personal and civil rights. The issues are human rights and access to justice. Those are the principles. The shape that government takes to ensure those is a matter of debate as to what form it takes in different countries. And so there's not a one size fits all here. What I think is important is that we have not, as Americans, focused our support for other countries, our assistance for other countries, in ensuring that those are the goals that get met. In just little ways, I never quite understood how, when you look at our foreign aid program, and I'm talking about our military assistance program, which is deplorable. I mean, it serves our objectives, not the objectives of countries in the region. But our assistance programs do not serve the purposes of democracy building. I mean, I never quite understood how we, a capitalist country, focus our assistance on assistance to states, which, I mean, the money we give to Egypt builds the military as a state within the state. They're an alternative to the state. We've never paid attention to that. What there was a fledgling effort at during the Clinton administration that Vice President Gore led was the Gore-Mubarak initiative that tried to create private sector to private sector and to create a fund that would support private sector and public-private ventures. I argued that when I was working with Vice President Gore on the Israel-Palestine issue, and we started Builders for Peace. Our goal was to create a fund through AID that would help build the private sector in the West Bank and Gaza, which was set to take off after the Oslo Accords. It didn't. What happened was the aid program went through AID, and we boast that more than 80 cents on every dollar gets spent on American contractors who oftentimes know nothing about the country that they're going into, but have some access to somebody in the bowels of the State Department that get the contract. I mean, for example, I was chaired the session on the Palestinian economy at the first international summit on that issue in Casablanca. And I'll never forget, we had 3 Palestinian ministers speaking about what they needed. They needed investment in private sector. They needed to, freedom to import, export, et cetera. And guy comes up to me, 30-something-year-old kid, after not being dismissive of 30-year-olds, but he comes up to me and he says, hi, can I meet the ministers? And I said, sure, but who are you? He said, I'm the guy that just got the AID contract on teaching Palestinians how to be entrepreneurs. I'm like, number one, I didn't know that existed. Number two, it was $11 million out of the 150 we were giving to the Palestinians. And number three, who is this guy? And Palestinians don't need to be taught how to be entrepreneurs. They need a nickel to be able to invest and become entrepreneurs. Look at the experience of Palestinians worldwide. They are some of the most successful small business people in America. But we were going to teach them how to be entrepreneurs by giving it to a kid who had worked at AID for 5 years, had contacts, and then when the contract came up, he bid on it, knew how to do the bidding, and he won it. We build things they don't want. There was one of the biggest projects in Gaza during the early years was a 10, 11-story building that had a huge sign out front, gift of the American people to the people of Palestine, of Gaza, or whatever it was. And it was 11 stories, and the apartments were selling for about $164,000 in a part of Palestine where the income level, the GDP per person, was something in the range of $600. I mean, what was the thinking that went on to that? And so this idea of American assistance going through AID and not going to projects that are actually demand driven, but they're supply driven. We got money, somebody's got a great idea, let's do it. As opposed to saying, what do you need? Let's do an assessment here and let's work it out. It's the same in Egypt. It's the same in Tunisia. It's the same in every other country that we work in. We do, and it was the same in Iraq. Contractors made huge bundles of money. The Iraqi people did not benefit. And that is, I think, the tragedy of what's going on here. I could say more about other areas of assistance, but no, I think that our aid programs don't provide, as Obama wanted them, suggested that they should, although he didn't put any muscle behind it and Congress never acted on it, was to create the building blocks of democracy. You can't just teach democracy. You have to create the kind of middle class that is ultimately going to be empowered to seek and demand democracy. That's where we failed, I think, in our aid programs. But there's an industry here in Washington that makes bundles off of getting those contracts. And they're not going to give up easy. That's a whole different kind of revolving door that operates here.
Indeed, and let's stay in the region of Palestine and Israel, which you referenced a few times in these comments, and think about some of the unintended consequences that the Arab Spring has had for Israel. Of course, last year they normalized relations with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Do you think in some way that this normalization can be attributed to the Arab Spring? How or how not? And will the legacy of this Arab Spring continue to affect Israel and Palestine?
Number one, it had no relationship at all to it. It was Trump, basically. It was Trump. It was Arab governments putting their finger up in the air to see which way the wind was blowing and thinking, what do I need to do to protect me? What do I need to do to be secure, given this change that's taking place in America? And they figured this would buy them time, and they each got something for the deal that they made. I mean, Morocco got recognition of its control over a territory that had never been recognized before by the US. Sudan got taken off the terrorism list. UAE got a deal in trade with the US and military assistance, military sales program. The UAE did actually get something from Israel in terms of annexation, or at least a commitment not to annex. And from the polling that we did before and after, it did have an effect on Israeli opinion, I think. And I think the UAE still has some leverage in Israel because of the great hopes that Israelis have for this relationship. They do have leverage in terms of how Israel behaves. If they choose to use it, it can have consequence. In the polling that we did, I call Palestine the wound in the heart that never heals. And it is for the Arabs what Wounded Knee is to indigenous peoples here in America. It is an event that happened. It's a thing that's happened to a people that are very much like me. And as I see them suffer, even if I hate Hamas or I hate Arafat or I hate the PLO, when Palestinians are being hurt, the Arab world feels it in their heart. And so it's always there. The point was that for a long time, very little had happened. And the Palestinian leadership has become both dysfunctional and I think two different kinds of corruption, but they're both they've become patronage systems that operate the old way. There's no vision. There's no sense of inspiration that they give. And the rest of the Arab world looking at Iraq, looking at Syria, looking at Libya, looking at Tunisia, looking at whatever, in the middle of, and Iran and the threat and the danger that it posed, when we asked them, would normalization without peace be something desirable? In most Arab countries, they were saying yes. And then when we were so puzzled by it, because we'd never seen that before, we said, why? And here, we did a follow-up survey, and they told us, it might stop the killing. Maybe it will give us some leverage to secure rights for Palestinians. Maybe at least people's lives might get better. Maybe in some cases, they said, maybe it'll help us get better relations with the United States. It wasn't out of love for Israel. It was more like, I don't know where else to go. I don't know what else to do. Maybe this will do something. So no, it wasn't Arab Spring. It was, I think, the 8 years of Bush and the disaster that represented for the region. It was 8 years of Obama and the huge inflated sense of expectation that the president himself created. I remember saying to Obama in his last year in office, I went to see him and he said, so what do you think? And I said, I'm really disappointed. He said, yeah, their expectations were too high. I said, no, sir, you created those expectations. I didn't give the Cairo speech. You gave the speech. I'm not the one that said, we will change Washington. We will change America. We will change the world. I mean, talk about inflated expectations. He created them. And then he completely disowned them and blamed the people that he let down. And then 4 years of Trump. I mean, for God's sake, have some pity on the people in the region who, after 20 years of this absolute insanity of up, down, and then Trump, all of a sudden say, what are we going to do? How do we get out of this? And where do we go? I think that, there's a bit of, post-traumatic shock going on here. And people are scrambling because ultimately they need to save themselves.
Indeed, we see that very pronounced in this part of the world and many other places as well. And let's stay in the region. And Dr. Khatib, I want to ask this question of you. When we think about Saudi Arabia and Iran's struggle for regional power in the Middle East, often referred to as a Cold War or proxy wars throughout the region. And while the conflict between these two nations has, of course, a very long history, the Arab Spring in particular became a catalyst for more crises throughout the region. And furthermore, the United States, as we've just talked about, has played an ever-present role in the regional tension between these two powers of Iran and Saudi Arabia. In your opinion, will the Middle East Cold War continue to grip the region for the foreseeable future? Do you see any path to peace?
Well, do I see a path to peace? Yes, always. It's human nature to seek peace eventually, because everyone just wants to live a decent life. So I am optimistic in the long run. And no, the Arab world is not exceptional. The Arab people are not more interested in war and conflict than other humans on the planet. People just want to have a decent life. But when it comes to your question on the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, I think this is a binary that we really need to move beyond now. Yes, for quite some time, we had Iranian interests outside its borders and Saudi interests outside its borders play out in many countries in the region. They played out in Syria, played out in Lebanon, played out in lots of other places. However, in recent years, the situation has shifted because on the one hand, Saudi Arabia felt a bit let down under the Obama administration because Obama was so focused on getting a nuclear deal with Iran that he decided to split that issue from the issue of Iran's regional engagement. And this is something that Saudi Arabia was worried about because it saw in Iran's regional role in the Arab world in particular a challenge to its own influence in the region. And when it saw that the US is not really interested in talking to Iran about that, it felt a bit let down. And so you have Saudi Arabia on the one hand feeling that if it's gonna in a way take on Iran, not militarily, but through increasing and competing for influence, then it doesn't have US support in that. And frankly, Saudi does not have the capacity to do it on its own. So Saudi instead started shifting its attention to its own immediate region, which is the Gulf. And with time, there were other domestic dynamics happening inside Saudi Arabia that led Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Gulf region to pay more attention to their region than to what's happening further afield. And Iran, at the same time, felt that this is actually quite a good opportunity for itself to increase its own influence. So we saw during this period an increase of Iranian involvement in Syria, a rise for Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iranian support reaching the Houthis in Yemen. And therefore, Iran expanded its regional role. And Saudi Arabia, apart from Yemen, where there was a direct confrontation because Yemen happens to be next to Saudi Arabia, literally geographically, in general, the region is no longer dictated by this rivalry. If anything, I will say that all countries that are involving themselves in this region are acting primarily out of national interest and are acting in a very pragmatic way. And sometimes they may consider a particular country to be a rival politically, but they might trade with it economically. And so it's not really anymore about clashing Sunnis and Shia or clashing ideologies. It's really about pursuing national interest and being very pragmatic about it. And therefore, I think trying to understand the region and what's happening now through the prism of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry misses this new dynamic. Plus, right now, really, I will say Iran is the more active actor across the region than Saudi Arabia. Iran still has military presence in Lebanon and Iraq and Syria and Yemen, whereas Saudi Arabia's role has largely retreated, and Saudi is no longer bankrolling Lebanese politicians that it considers allies like it used to. Saudi Arabia is no longer trying to topple the Assad regime in Syria. As I said, its priorities have really shifted to its own domestic dynamics and the Gulf region. So again, when we say Iranian-Saudi rivalry, this kind of gives the impression that there are two actors that are kind of on the same level, and that's not the situation right now.
Can I come in there for a second?
Please.
I agree completely, but I would add the following, that I wrote a piece for The Nation magazine here I think a couple months ago, called Biden Must Think Big in the Middle East. And it's not just Saudi and Iran, it's also Russia, it's also Turkey, it's also Qatar, it's also UAE has a role, and Egypt has a role, and the French have a role, have had a role in several of the countries, Libya, for example, and Lebanon. When I looked at the region, there is something akin to a Cold War, but it's also a hot war, and it is taking place in several countries. And I said in the article, I said there's something akin to a world war, but a regional war that involves some of the same players in different configurations in each of these countries, and not just in the countries, but in the Eastern Mediterranean over resources and over shipping, in the Red Sea, the same, in the Gulf waters, et cetera. So what I suggested was that something akin to an OSCE needed to be examined. And that I was, I supported the President Obama in the Iran deal, but like John Kerry, I was against it before I was for it, because I thought it was shooting too small. It was playing, it was trying to stop Iran from getting a bomb that they never had, and even if they had, could never use, because there's no using it in the Middle East. I mean, once you use it, wherever you use it, you kill more of your friends than you do of your enemies. And oh, by the way, 5 minutes later, you're dead. I mean, but I used to say that the best way to stop the Iranian bomb was let them have it and then just ridicule the hell out of them, which would be like, what are you going to do with it, little man? Sit on it, feed your people with. I mean, it's not something that is as worrisome as Iran's involvement in Lebanon, where Hezbollah is a major block to real change, as it was in Syria, as it is in Yemen, where a deal had been made to stabilize the situation after the youth revolt with a new government. And then the Houthi, with some Iranian backing, were able to overturn that and lead the country into this chaos that it's in right now. Not to say Saudi Arabia is innocent. They weren't innocent. But the reality here is that there are bigger fish to fry than Iran's bomb, putting all the resources and all of the diplomatic support and all of the world's attention on a bomb, when what we should do with the P5+1, if anything, is convene a regional conference to create stability, to create better governance, to create a regional trade arena, to create a pact of non-belligerence, so that Iran, you will be secure and no one will invade you. And oh, by the way, UAE and Saudi, no one will invade you, and you will be secure as well. And that's the only way forward right now, is to look at this region as a region where multipolarity has become chaotic, and it needs the kind of stability that we did with Eastern Europe after World War II, which was not perfect, but there were no major wars in Eastern Europe until the fall of the Soviet Union, at which point these countries were ready to transition. They're not ready to transition now because there's too much external, local, and global interference to allow this normal development to take place. So that's why I think we need to think bigger. But unfortunately, we're not thinking bigger right now. And so the dangers are there, not just because of the uprisings in the countries, but the configuration of global and regional power elites fighting it out in each country and in the Gulf waters and in the Eastern Mediterranean waters, et cetera, over over resources and over shipping and over security issues. I mean, when you get Egypt and Russia sort of going on a provocative mission through the waters to show Turkey who's boss, that's stuff that you got to be careful about. And I don't think anyone is focused on how do we tamp that down. No, we can't solve it, and no one is going to win a war. But what we can do is stabilize the situation and to try to give people not what they want, but what they need in order to move to the next stage. Sorry.
Very good, thank you. That's all right. Thanks, Dr. Zogby. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. And as is the tradition here at the council, we always take that first question from a student. They're the young people who are taking time to develop a passion for world affairs and maybe will help us solve some of these problems in the future. Layla Luna is a second-year political science student at Temple University, and she has a question for you today. Layla?
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Dr. Khatib and Dr. Zogby. So I know this was touched on a bit earlier, but I was wondering if we could go into more detail about what exactly the Muslim Brotherhood is, what their goals are, and if a group like them could ever work in mainstream political processes.
Dr. Khatib, would you like to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big question that I'm going to try to answer in like 2 minutes. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood started off as obviously a group driven by an ideology, which was to try to Islamize society and Islamize the political system. It originated in Egypt, and then it started existing in different places, not just in the Arab world, but also outside. With time, the organization, because it existed in so many different places, started being influenced by the different contexts in which it existed. So when we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, we're no longer talking about one organization that is coherent. It really differs in different countries. In some countries like Egypt, it had a lot of popular support, sometimes because it was reaching out to people through giving them services when the government was not really delivering. So it had a lot of support like that. Sometimes it was because it was saying we can eventually present a political alternative, and that was attractive to some people. But in other countries like Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood was never really popular. It was never really influential. Roll on 2011, we saw in Egypt the election of a president after the removal of Mubarak and the uprisings, and that President Morsi came from the Muslim Brotherhood. One of the biggest mistakes he made was that he tried to put himself above the law at one point, and he issued a presidential decree to give himself these powers, and this led to wide anger. And this led the deep state in Egypt, which is basically the military, to use that as an opportunity to orchestrate a military coup and remove him, and then list the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization and crack down on it. And this caused, even within Egypt, fracture within the organization, so that some younger people engaged in violent acts as a result, and some older people said, actually, we need to just basically retreat from politics altogether. So the organization, they're fragmented. Compare that to what happened in Tunisia, where you had a political party called Ennahda that is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, transform into a political party that basically said, we're going to try to play by the rules of the democratic game. So we're going to be a political party and contest elections and be very pragmatic. And so they evolved in a very different way from what happened to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And these are just two examples. So when you look at the organization in different countries, you'll see different outcomes and different behaviors. The key thing here is, as demonstrated by the case of Ennahda in Tunisia, there is potential for these political Islam groups to basically transform into political actors that respect the rules of the game. So, you know, thinking about them as rigid and kind of non-changing is very, I think, inaccurate. We should just pay attention to the context, the local context, and pay attention to their transformation over time, which may, as I said, be in a negative direction, but it may also be in a positive one.
Very good. Thank you for that. And we've got time for just one or two more audience questions. Dr. Zogby, I'll pass this one to you first from Bonnie Squires. She writes, is there a lasting effect in Tunisia because the country was forced to house Fatah?
She means the PLO?
Ghani, if you're here, yeah, I think so.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that that had any lasting impact, nor Tunisia also hosted the Arab League for many years. I think the lasting impact in Tunisia was the regime of Habib Bourguiba, who actually helped spawn the kind of civil society and secularized civil society that ultimately created the structures that allowed, I think, for a competition with Ennahda. So that, you know, when I was talking about forming political parties, there is a structure in Tunisia. I remember being at a conference on democracy in the 4th anniversary of the Ben Ali takeover, and I was part of an American delegation at the thing. And the toughest resistance to the Brotherhood at this conference were Tunisian women who had experienced under Bourguiba freedom and the opportunity to form societies and to advance as women. And they were deathly, I mean, really frightened at the prospect. So I think that Bourguiba played an important role. And I think that the lasting consequences of that are still with us. But I don't see that the PLO presence there or the Arab League presence there, which I think the Arab League presence was longer than the PLO presence, because the PLO didn't come until 83. The Arab League was there right after Camp David, when they were expelled, or not, when Egypt was, you know, sort of sidelined in the Arab League, and then Arafat went back. But I think Egypt didn't come to house the Arab League till later. So no, I don't think so. I mean, I think that the thing about Tunisia was that some would refer to it as the Lebanon of the Northern Mediterranean, and it was partly because of the French culture. It was partly because of the political culture that it had spawned, and the fact that it was a very urban and very there was a cosmopolitan nature to the political discourse in the country. Those, I think, were more important than external groups who were housed there for a while. Or that may be the reason why the external groups were housed there, actually.
Chicken and the egg. All right. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for our conversation today. There are many more questions we would love to ask both of you as experts on these topics, but we'll have to hold there. Dr. Zogby, Dr. Khatib, thank you so much for your time and sharing your perspective on honesty and expertise with us. And thank you to our audience, and including members of the World Affairs Council and new friends and guests joining us today. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Dr. Zogby's latest book, The Tumultuous Decade, Arab Public Opinion, he's got it right there, and the upheavals of 2010 to 2019, it's linked on our website on the event page.
Thank you.
Of course, yes.
Shameless. Shameless.
Putting in the work, yes, to write a book. We're happy to help share it. I know people are hungry to hear more from both of you. And we invite you to check out our website and other upcoming programs, different topics, but the same intensity and authenticity and nonpartisan approach that you've enjoyed here today with us. We've got international perspectives on food innovation and technology, focusing on Latin America. And of course, the relationship between Hong Kong and China and democracy is on deck. Stay tuned for more programming announcements, including a return to in-person programming this fall. We love Zoom, but we miss seeing all of your faces and the interaction one-on-one. And if you're ready to go even farther and travel and see the world, we've got about 50 international educational tours on our schedule on our website. So please take a look at wacphila.org. We wish everyone a good day. And one last thank you to Dr. Khatib and Dr. Zogby.
Thank you. And
thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you, Lauren. Bye-bye.
Pleasure was ours. Thank you. Bye-bye.